Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. He stood in court, accused of attacking a cop, calm, silent, and wearing the same steady gaze he once had on the battlefield. The officer said he was violent. The courtroom believed it. But what if the man on trial wasn't just another defendant, but a decorated Navy SEAL who spent 2 decades defending the very justice now denying him? Why did he stay silent so long? And what truth was he waiting to unleash? If this already has you leaning in, hit that like button. Share this video and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now let me take you inside a courtroom where one man's silence spoke louder than any lie. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the county courthouse, casting long golden shafts across the polished wood floor. The room was quiet, too quiet, not the silence of peace, but the kind that held its breath, waiting for something to happen. At the defense table sat a tall black man in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks. His name, Darius Cole. His posture was straight, hands folded loosely in front of him. No cuffs, no visible fear, just calm, controlled, like a man who'd been here before, or somewhere far worse. The whispers had already begun before the judge even stepped in. "That's the guy who hit the cop, right? I heard he tried to grab the officer's gun. Big guy like that? I'd be scared too if I were the cop." Darius didn't flinch. His eyes didn't wander. He simply sat, still as stone, but far from lifeless. There was something about him, something that didn't quite fit the narrative. Across the aisle at the plaintiff's table, Officer Greg Thornton adjusted his dark blue uniform. White, mid-30s, square jaw, clean-shaven, decorated with polished pins and a practiced sense of superiority. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, smirk dancing just beneath the surface. He'd told his story. It was clean, convincing, and today he was ready to make sure it stuck. In front of Darius, nervously flipping through a folder full of mismatched notes, sat Elias Reed, young, black, barely a year out of law school. He'd taken this case pro bono, believing somehow that the truth would be enough. But now, looking at Darius so still and unreadable, he was starting to question everything. Elias cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Cole, you sure you're ready for this?" Darius didn't answer at first. He didn't need to. He just gave a slow nod, measured, deliberate. And in that moment, Reed saw it. Not fear, not hesitation, resolve. Whatever this man had been through, whatever story the officer was about to sell the court, it wasn't going to break him. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice ringing through the chamber. "All rise, court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Helena Price presiding." Chairs scraped back, papers shuffled. Thornton straightened his tie. And Darius, he simply rose, as if the weight of the world didn't faze him. The trial had begun. The judge gave a small nod. "Officer Thornton, you may take the stand." Thornton rose with the confidence of a man who had told this story a dozen times and expected no pushback on the 13th. His uniform was immaculate, badge gleaming under the overhead lights. He adjusted his belt, took a deep breath, and strode toward the witness chair like an actor stepping onto a stage. He raised his right hand, took the oath, and settled into the seat. "Please describe what happened on the night in question," the prosecutor prompted, his tone smooth and rehearsed. Thornton leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the jury. "It was about 11:15 p.m., he began. "I was responding to a call about a possible break-in on the east side, near the old Kensington hardware store." He paused, letting that sink in. Break-in, night, danger. "That's when I saw the defendant," he continued, gesturing casually toward Darius. "He was standing just outside the store, loitering, pacing, looked agitated." Several jurors scribbled in their notepads. One older woman furrowed her brow. A man in the front row leaned in. "I got out of my vehicle. We asked him what he was doing. That's when things escalated." The prosecutor raised a brow. "Escalated? How?" Thornton exhaled heavily, the kind of breath meant to say this was hard on me. "He became aggressive, loud, refused to identify himself. I gave multiple warnings. He ignored them all." He lowered his voice, added just the right amount of tension. Then he shoved me hard in the chest. The jury looked up. And when I tried to restrain him, Thornton said, voice steady, he reached for my firearm. I had no choice but to take him down. A gasp escaped from someone in the gallery. The judge didn't scold them. She didn't need to. The prosecutor nodded slowly, almost solemnly. Did you feel your safety was at risk? Absolutely, Thornton replied without hesitation. And do you believe you acted within your duty as an officer of the law? Thornton looked toward the jury again. I didn't just act within it. I followed protocol to the letter. The prosecutor turned to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. Thornton sat back, hands folded neatly in his lap. Face calm, in control. But across the room, Darius Cole sat unmoved. His posture hadn't changed. He hadn't blinked, hadn't clenched his fists, hadn't even shifted in his seat. But his eyes, those eyes, followed every motion, every word, every muscle twitch of Thornton's, like a man trained to read intent before it was spoken aloud. And he saw it, the way Thornton's fingers had tapped nervously against his thigh when asked about the shove. The slight pause, less than half a second, before the words reached for my firearm. Darius said nothing. He didn't need to, because sometimes the truth doesn't shout. It waits, and it watches. The courtroom shifted, not loudly but subtly, like a tide pulling back before a wave. Officer Thornton had just finished his testimony. He sat at the plaintiff's table looking pleased. Lips pursed in a smirk he didn't bother to hide. The jury scribbled quietly. The judge leaned back. The air felt heavier now, like one version of the story had already taken root. At the defense table, Elias Reed clutched his pen like a lifeline. His fingers trembled slightly as he leaned toward Darius and whispered low, trying not to be heard. If we don't start poking holes in his story now, they'll buy it. Every word. Darius didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, locked on the empty witness stand, still focused like a man watching an ambush unfold, yet not moving a muscle. Darius, say something. Anything. At that, Darius finally turned his head just slightly and looked Reed in the eye. His voice was calm, low, steel wrapped in velvet. Eli, he said, I was trained to stay alive in silence, not panic and noise. He paused, then added almost as if to himself, the truth has its own voice. When it's ready, it speaks. Reed blinked. He didn't understand it, not yet, but something in Darius's tone made him stop pressing. Across the room, Thornton glanced over again, still smirking. But for the first time, his smirk seemed a little forced, like he was looking too often at a man who refused to react. The gallery buzzed with restrained curiosity. Why isn't he saying anything? If I was innocent, I'd be shouting from the rooftops. Maybe he can't defend himself. They didn't know. They didn't see what Reed was just beginning to see. Darius wasn't frozen. He was waiting, like a soldier in a combat zone, lying low, counting breaths, letting the enemy speak first, letting them overreach. And when that moment came, he wouldn't just respond, he would dismantle everything. The courtroom was still, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet you get before a thunderstorm, the airtight charge, ready to break. Darius Cole stepped up to the witness stand with the same calm composure he'd held since the trial began. He adjusted the microphone, not out of nerves but precision. Everything about his movement said, I've done harder things than this. The prosecutor stood and approached, flipping open a legal pad like he already knew the story's ending. Mr. Cole, he began, can you tell us what you were doing the night of the incident? Darius didn't look at him. He looked forward at the jury. I was waiting for an Uber. I just left dinner with a friend. The prosecutor's tone took on a note of casual suspicion. Where exactly were you waiting? Outside the old hardware store, on the public sidewalk. It was closed. So you were loitering? Darius paused for a beat, just long enough for the word to hang awkwardly in the air. I was standing quietly, not blocking anyone, not making a scene, just waiting. A few jurors shifted in their seats. The prosecutor pressed on, his voice edged with suggestion. Officer Thornton said you looked agitated. Would you describe yourself that way? Darius finally turned toward him, slow, deliberate. I was tired. It was late. But no, I wasn't agitated. Not until I was approached. The prosecutor leaned in a little. Approached? How? Darius' jaw flexed. He didn't introduce himself. Just walked up, shined a flashlight in my face, and started asking questions. Demanded to know what I was doing there. He glanced again at the jury. Not pleading, not angry, just telling it plainly. I asked him why I was being questioned, and that's when he said, Darius' voice lowered. The words dropped into the room like lead. Men like you need to learn to follow. The room stiffened. A ripple of discomfort passed through the benches behind him. One juror blinked rapidly. Another scribbled something without looking up. The judge lifted her gavel in warning, but didn't bring it down. Not yet. The prosecutor straightened his tie, eyes narrowing. That's a strong accusation. Do you have any proof the officer actually said that? No recording, Darius said simply. His body camera wasn't working that night. He let the silence hammer, then added, how convenient. Now the gavel did strike. Order. But it was too late. The seed had been planted. People were shifting, whispering. Thornton at the plaintiff's table stared ahead, expression flat, but a slight twitch in his cheek betrayed something beneath the surface. The prosecutor tried to pivot. Mr. Cole, with all due respect, you're a big man. Is it possible Officer Thornton felt physically threatened? Maybe your tone, your posture. Darius didn't respond immediately. He let the question hang there, raw and obvious. Threatened by me? Asking a question? His eyes flicked to Thornton, then back to the jury. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't raise a hand. I raised a question. And then softer, almost to himself, but loud enough to be heard. Sometimes it's not about what you do. It's about what they expect you to do. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. He sat back, still controlled. Not just a defendant, a presence. The judge's gavel struck twice, sharp, commanding. We'll take a short recess before continuing with cross-examination. People shuffled in their seats. Some stood to stretch, but no one left the courtroom. Not now. Something had shifted. You could feel it in the air. The temperature of doubt beginning to rise. At the defense table, Elias Reed leaned in toward Darius, his voice low. That line you gave them about what they expect you to do, that hit hard. Darius didn't answer. He was still, but there was a tightness in his jaw now, as if holding back something more dangerous than words. Reed pulled a small USB drive from his briefcase, hands slightly sweaty. There's something else. It came in last night. Anonymous bystander footage. I've only seen part of it, but if it's what I think it is. He trailed off, looking at Darius with something between awe and suspicion. You've been holding back, haven't you? Darius finally turned to him. Not everything that's true needs to be said right away. Reed stared at him for a moment, then nodded once. Fair, but this needs to be seen. The judge adjusted her glasses, voice steady. Mr. Reed, you may proceed with your cross-examination. Reed stood slowly, like someone walking onto ice that might crack beneath him. Your Honor, the defense respectfully requests to enter a video into evidence, recorded by a civilian witness present at the time of Mr. Cole's arrest. The prosecutor shot to his feet. Objection. This evidence was not disclosed during discovery. Sit down, the judge said without hesitation. We'll allow it. A hush fell over the courtroom as the screen was set up. The lights dimmed slightly. All eyes turned forward. The video began, grainy at first, taken from a cell phone, nighttime, a sidewalk, the flickering glow of a street lamp. Darius stood still, hands visible, open at his sides. Officer Thornton approached from the left side of the frame, flashlight already up. Voice sharp but muffled by distance. What are you doing here? Waiting for a ride, Darius replied, voice calm. The camera jerked slightly as the person filming tried to keep it steady. Thornton stepped closer, suddenly aggressive. You look nervous? Got something to hide? No, sir, Darius said, stepping back half a step. I'm just waiting. Suddenly, Thornton shoved him, back toward the patrol car, forcing his arms behind his back. I haven't done anything wrong, Darius said louder now, but not yelling. Hands behind your back. I'm not resisting. Darius's voice in the video was clear, steady, even as his face was pressed against cold metal. I haven't done anything wrong. That last line echoed as the video ended. The room was frozen. Thornton's face had gone pale. A few jurors shook their heads. One woman had her lips pressed together so tightly they nearly disappeared. Even the judge sat a little straighter. Her eyes narrowed. Reed turned slowly to the jury. What you just witnessed is the difference between narrative and truth. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. He returned to his seat, breathing hard, adrenaline peaking. He glanced at Darius, who remained composed, just as he had been in the video. But there was something new in his expression now. Not silence, readiness. Reed leaned in and whispered, "That's a crack in the wall." Darius responded, his voice barely audible, but firm. "Walls don't fall with cracks alone." Reed stared at him, the weight of those words settling in. "Then what brings it down?" Darius looked forward, eyes locked on Thornton. "The truth, all of it." The courthouse had long emptied by the time Elias Reed pulled into Darius Cole's driveway. The sun was gone, replaced by a sky heavy with stars, and a silence that felt too clean, too polite, like the world didn't know what it had almost let happen. Reed sat in the car for a moment, still gripping the steering wheel, heart thudding from the weight of what had unfolded in court. The video had cracked the illusion, but something inside him knew it wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed truth. And Darius had been holding it like a man trained to hide what mattered most. The door opened before he could knock. Darius stood there in a navy sweatshirt and black athletic pants, no longer in court attire, but still carrying that same steady presence. "Come in," he said simply. Reed stepped into the house. The air inside was cool, still, minimalist. No television, no clutter. Just a room with discipline etched into every corner. And then he saw it. On the wall across from the front door, a framed photograph of a younger Darius flanked by 4 other men in fatigues, all with arms around each other and sand in their boots. Below it, a shadow box, medals, pins, a folded American flag polished until it gleamed. And beside it, on a small table, a file thick and worn at the edges. Discharge. Lieutenant Commander Darius A. Cole, U.S. Navy SEALs. Reed froze. "You were..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Darius didn't look away from the flag in his hands. "Lieutenant Commander," he said softly, "SEAL Team 8, 20 years. Reed's voice came in a breath. "Jesus! Why didn't you say anything?" Darius finally turned, eyes meeting his. "Because people don't see what you've done. They see what they're afraid of." He set the flag down with reverence. "I've stood in war zones, been shot at in 3 different countries. I've pulled brothers from burning trucks, led men through hell, and brought most of them back." He paused, his voice didn't shake, but it was full. "And today, I stood in a courtroom in my own country and watched a man try to use a badge to erase everything I've ever been." Reed stepped closer, words tumbling. "But that changes everything. If they knew this, if they saw you for who you really are, they'd still see a black man who questioned a white cop in the dark," Darius interrupted, his voice low but sharp. "And some part of them would still wonder if I provoked it." He walked over to a shelf and pulled out another photo, this one of him standing at attention in dress uniform, a Medal of Valor on his chest, his mother beside him, eyes full of pride. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It never was." Reed swallowed hard. "Then why fight so quietly? Why hold it in?" Darius looked at him for a long moment. "Because silence can be a strategy, but not forever." He turned to face the window. Outside, the night was still, but in his voice, something had shifted. "Tomorrow," he said, "I won't sit still anymore." Reed nodded slowly. "You sure?" Darius gave him the faintest smile. "I've never been more sure of anything." They stood in silence for a few beats, one man holding the truth, the other now holding the weight of him. Reed finally broke the silence. "Then let's give them more than a crack in the wall." Darius nodded, voice firm. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. Not louder, not fuller, but heavier, like everyone present could feel something approaching. Something they couldn't quite name, but knew they wouldn't forget. Darius Cole sat at the defense table, his hands folded, his face calm. But Elias Reed noticed it. Just beneath the stillness, there was a quiet fire building. And today, Darius wasn't going to keep it buried. The judge called for continuation. "Mr. Reed," she said, "you may call your next witness." Reed stood slowly, then looked to his client. "The defense calls Darius Cole back to the stand." A rustle passed through the gallery. Darius rose, not hurried, not tense, just steady, like a soldier returning to a familiar battlefield. He took the stand again, adjusted the microphone. Reed stepped forward, voice clear. "Mr. Cole, court has heard a great deal about your actions during your encounter with Officer Thornton, but we'd like to take a moment to talk about you. Who you are." Darius looked toward the jury. His voice, when it came, was low, but it carried. "My name is Darius A. Cole. I am a retired lieutenant commander with the United States Navy SEALs. Served 20 years, multiple deployments, Afghanistan, Iraq, Horn of Africa. I've led missions most people will never hear about, and I've buried men who never came home." The room went silent. The jury froze. One juror blinked hard, stunned. At the back of the courtroom, a man in a plain jacket, older, gray at the temples, nodded slowly. A veteran. You could see it in his eyes. Darius continued, his voice firm now, like the words had been waiting years to be spoken. "I've stood in foreign lands with enemies pointing rifles at my chest. I've learned to control fear, to manage chaos, to keep my team alive under fire." He paused, then looked directly at Officer Thornton. "And yet, the first time I was called a threat without raising a hand was here, at home, on a quiet street, waiting for a ride." Thornton shifted in his seat. His hand, resting on the table, trembled just slightly. He didn't meet Darius' gaze. "I didn't attack anyone," Darius said. "I didn't resist. I used the training that kept me alive in war zones, to keep me alive that night. I kept my voice level. I kept my hands where he could see them. I followed commands, even the ones that had no legal basis, because I've seen what happens when men like me don't." He looked back to the jury, letting that hang. "You've heard Officer Thornton call me dangerous, but you haven't heard why. It wasn't because of anything I did. It was because I stood still and asked a question." A murmur rippled through the gallery, then fell quiet again, the weight of his words sinking deeper than any gavel could strike. Reed stepped forward carefully. "Mr. Cole, why didn't you reveal your service early?" Darius paused. His answer was soft. "Because I shouldn't have to wear a uniform for my rights to be respected. I shouldn't have to prove my worth. Not to a cop, not to a courtroom, not to anyone." He glanced toward the rows behind the jury, people who had whispered about him just the day before. "I kept it to myself because I wanted to be treated like a citizen, not a soldier, just a man, standing on a sidewalk." The judge sat motionless. The prosecutor looked down, lips pressed tight. In the back row, the veteran who'd nodded earlier now stood. He didn't speak. He simply saluted. One slow, deliberate motion. Others noticed. A woman in the gallery wiped a tear. One juror set their pen down, hands folded as if no longer needing to take notes. They were already convinced. And Thornton? He looked small now. The confidence drained from his face. His fingers clutched at the edge of the table. His eyes darted, but never landed on Darius again. Because some truths are too heavy to look at. And Darius, he didn't look like a man trying to clear his name anymore. He looked like a man reminding the country who he had always been. The courtroom was silent, not a respectful silence, not the kind you give to authority. This was different. This was the silence of people realizing they might have believed the wrong story. Officer Thornton sat at the witness stand again, hands clenched in his lap. Gone was the smooth, smug confidence. His posture was tighter now, shoulders slightly hunched, as though bracing for something he could no longer control. Elias Reed stepped forward. No notes, no script. Just truth, sharp as a blade. Officer Thornton, he said slowly, you testified that Mr. Cole was aggressive, hostile, in danger. Thornton cleared his throat, barely nodding. Yes, I stand by that. You also testified that he reached for your weapon, correct? Yes. But we've all seen the video, Reed said. We've watched him stand still. We've heard him say, I'm not resisting. We've seen his hands, visible, open. Thornton shifted. His jaw twitched, but he said nothing. Reed stepped a little closer. Tell me, officer, do you feel any shame about accusing a decorated Navy SEAL, someone who's risked his life fighting the Taliban, of being threatening, just because he's tall, strong, and black? That last word cut through the room like a whip. Thornton blinked rapidly. I didn't know who he was, he stammered. Exactly, Reed snapped. You didn't know, but you decided anyway. He let the silence stretch, the kind that forces people to sit with their discomfort. You saw a black man standing on a sidewalk, and the only thing you reached for faster than your cuffs was a conclusion. Thornton opened his mouth. I felt threatened. Reed's voice dropped, calm, but cold. You felt threatened by a man standing still, calm, law-abiding, asking a question. He turned to the jury. When a trained soldier keeps his composure, they call it discipline, until that soldier is black. Then they call it danger. He walked slowly across the courtroom, gaze never leaving the jurors. When a man like Darius Cole, who's walked through bomb zones, led rescue missions, and stood between bullets and his country, chooses to stay silent, they call it suspicious. When he asks a question, they call it defiance. When he doesn't flinch, they call it a threat. Reed turned and pointed gently, without aggression, toward Thornton. But when he lied, when he turns a citizen into a criminal to protect his own narrative, the system still calls it doing his job. He let that hang in the air. The jury sat frozen. No notes now, no shuffling, just listening, feeling. We say we want order, Reed continued, voice lower now. But order without justice is just control. He took a breath, looked down for a moment, then back up. Darius Cole didn't resist arrest. He resisted erasure. He resisted becoming another name we whisper about after it's too late. He stayed alive. And now he's standing here, so you, this jury, can decide if the truth still matters, or if it only matters when it comes from someone who looks like it should. A long pause, the kind that made you feel something had just shifted permanently. Reed turned and walked back to the defense table. Thornton stared down at his hands, pale, motionless. The judge looked over the courtroom. Even she didn't speak. And the jury, they didn't need to look at each other to know. The story had changed. And this time, the truth wasn't on the badge. The jury filed back into the courtroom. Their faces were composed, but something had shifted. You could see it in the way they walked. Slower, heavier. They carried not just the weight of evidence, but of conscience. The judge adjusted her robe and looked toward the foreperson, a middle-aged woman with calm eyes and the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to raise its voice. Madam Foreperson, she said, has the jury reached a verdict? She stood, cleared her throat. We have, Your Honor. The courtroom held its breath. In the case of the state versus Darius Cole on the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant not guilty. A murmur rippled across the room. On the charge of assaulting a police officer, we find the defendant not guilty. For a moment, it was like the world paused. Then the sound came, first softly, then growing. Applause from the back rows, from the sad eyes from strangers who had only days ago doubted him. The judge struck her gavel once. Order, please. But there was no real conviction in her voice. Even she, behind the bench, looked at Darius with something that resembled respect. Reed turned to Darius, eyes wide. We did it, he whispered. Darius didn't speak right away. He just exhaled, long, slow, controlled, like a man finally allowed to set down a weight he'd carried across continents and years. The judge looked down over her glasses. Mr. Cole, you may speak if you wish. Darius rose. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, he stepped to the center, not as a defendant, but as a voice. "I want to thank this court," he began, "and this jury, not for believing me, but for listening." He looked out across the room, toward Thornton, now seated with slumped shoulders and vacant eyes, toward the gallery full of people who had watched this case unfold like a story they weren't sure how to feel about. "I didn't win today because I'm a Navy SEAL," Darius said. "I didn't win because I've worn a uniform or carried a flag into battle." He paused, his voice grew quieter, but deeper. "I won because I stopped being silent, because I remembered that even the calmest voice has power, and that justice doesn't just belong to the loud or the privileged. It belongs to the one willing to stand, when standing alone is the hardest thing to do." He turned toward the jury one last time. "I stood on a sidewalk, unarmed, and asked a question. For that, I was labeled a threat, but I've faced real threats, and let me tell you, truth is never one of them." A hush fell again. Then from the back row, a boy's voice broke the silence. "Mama, I want to be like him." All heads turned. A young black boy, no older than 10, sat beside his mother, eyes wide, hands gripping the wooden bench. She smiled, pulled him close. "You will," she whispered. And in that moment, something eternal passed between them. Not just admiration, but inheritance. As Darius left the courtroom, cameras flashed, reporters shouted. But he didn't stop. He didn't need the noise. He had already been heard.